The Furthest Distances I've Travelled by Leontia Flynn. So this is a poem which is about change. It's a poem about what your expectations of life are, what you thought you would be doing, and then the contrast between what you actually end up doing and how and it's about how the narrator feels about that change. Let's just look at the overall picture first of all. You can see just from glancing at it that at the beginning the structure of it is a little bit more fragmented. You've got the short lines, the long lines, and by the end it becomes a little bit more regular. If you look at the last two stanzas, for example, you've got the kind of the three longer lines and the final shorter line, which isn't the pattern that you have in the rest of them. The rest of the stanzas are much more unpredictable. And we'll come back to that idea as we go through. But the things to be thinking about then in this poem are that overall shape and structure and rhyme or sound patterning. That's really important in this poem. So we'll have a little bit of a look at that as we go through now. So the title of the poem mentions travelling. The furthest distances I've travelled. We get the use of the superlative in furthest, suggesting that she's travelled a long way. This is a poem about travel, and it's about literal travel in the first kind of half of the poem. But then as we move through the poem, the idea of travelling becomes metaphorical, and she talks about the fact that actually the journeys she's made are more kind of emotional journeys, and the distances she's travelled are to do with relationships between people. And we'll come on to that when we come to the end. So we get the idea of travel used metaphorically as well as literally within the poem. And a thing to notice about the poem then, as I've mentioned, is the sound patterning in the poem. She makes a lot of use of rhyme, or particularly half rhymes. So we get some full rhyme, for example, rucksack and back. But then we get these words, spine and meridian. They don't rhyme, but there's an echo. They both share that final consonant of the N there and the N there, spine, meridian. Or if you look at this stanza, the second stanza, the last two lines, white and airport. It's not a rhyme, but there's an echo. We've got the T and the T, the final consonants there. The proper name for this is a half rhyme. So this is what a half rhyme is then, and there are various different or slightly different definitions of half rhyme because it's something that's kind of got broader and broader. But basically, an easy way of remembering it, or the simplest way to think of it, is that it's words that kind of rhyme, or they have a similar consonant sound, or sometimes the final vowel sounds or the final syllables are the same, but they're not actually full rhymes. I mean, if you look at what some of the other alternative names are, an imperfect rhyme, a near rhyme, a lazy rhyme, a slant rhyme. I've got near rhyme written down twice there, an off rhyme. They all mean the same thing. And it's words that nearly rhyme, but don't quite. For example, as you can see on the example there, bridge and grudge that share that j sound at the end. Or hat and bad that share the same vowel sound there. Or faces and houses, the z sound at the end. So Leontia Flynn makes use of these half rhymes throughout, and also she does something else interesting with rhymes that we'll think about in a minute, but let's just look at this first stanza. Like many folk, I think we start with this idea of travelling, and she's going off travelling. She's presumably fairly young, perhaps a student, and she thinks she's doing something really exciting because that's the thing you do. You go on a gap year, you go travelling for 6 months, whatever it is you do. But I think we get this sense right at the beginning that actually she thinks she's doing something, special and individual and important, but actually she's just doing what everybody else does. She is doing it like many folk. Plenty of other people do it. When I first saddled a rucksack, I think the use of that verb is quite interesting because I think it suggests that, she puts the rucksack on her as if it is a saddle. So it's almost like she's saying, she's a horse that's being ridden. She's being kind of, she almost like she's not really in charge of what she's doing, or she's not moving independently. She's just being ridden by somebody else. And I think that idea ties in with this in the first phrase of the poem, like many folk. She isn't actually being hugely independent and doing what she wants to do, an individual. She's doing what everybody else is doing. She's following the same path as everybody else, and she's being kind of led almost, or ridden by a horse. So when I first saddled a rucksack, feeling its weight on my back, and perhaps there's this idea of pressure. This is what she ought to do. It's, I'm doing this because that's what everybody does. The way my spine curved under it like a meridian. That simile there, like a meridian. A meridian, one meaning of it is it's one of those imaginary lines that goes around the globe and that the time zones are measured from. So it gives that sense of kind of travel and global travel. But also in acupuncture, in Chinese medicine, a meridian is one of the lines that supposedly kind of runs through your body, and it's one of those energy lines. So there's perhaps a sense that travelling gives us this sense of kind of energy and causes energy and enthusiasm to flow through her body. So when I put on my rucksack, I thought, yes, this is how to live. It's kind of, this is it. This is the life that I want. This is how one should live. I'm doing what I should be. And I think there's perhaps this sense of maybe the arrogance of youth, that she's got the answers. This is what life is all about. This is how I'm supposed to live. How is she supposed to live? On the beaten track, the Sherpa path. I think that's quite interesting because normally the phrase we would use would be off the beaten track, but she changes it here to on the beaten track. And again, I think this ties in with that idea that we had at the beginning, like many folk. I'm just doing what everybody else does. I'm on the beaten track, the well-beaten track, and I'm just kind of following the crowd, really. The Sherpa Pass, excuse me, the Sherpa Pass, which suggests, she's been off kind of trekking in the Himalayas or something like that. So she's been to these far-flung places, which she mentions. This is quite an interesting use of rhyme here as well, because we've got the word how. This is how to travel. And it looks like it should rhyme with this word. There should be a space there, between. We might think that this is a rhyme, but actually this place in Poland isn't pronounced Krakow, it's pronounced Krakow. So we get this idea of what's called an I rhyme. And an I rhyme, sometimes called visual rhyme or sight rhyme, is when two words look like they should rhyme, because the letters are the same, so they look like they ought to be full rhymes, but when you look at them, they don't really rhyme at all. They don't have similar sounds at all. There's some examples for you. Laughter and daughter. On the page, they look like they should rhyme, but they don't. Rough and though, flood, brood, cough, plough, low, cow. They don't rhyme, but they look like they should, so they are called I rhymes. So she uses that I rhyme, this is how to live, on the beaten track, the Sherpa Pass between Krakow and Zagreb, or the Siberian white cells of scattered airports. So she's mentioning these kind of far-flung places, Krakow and Zagreb and Siberia, to give this sense of travel. And I think that's conveyed also in this word here, the scattered airports, as if she's kind of, crisscrossing all over Europe. And as she is travelling like this, it came clear as over a tannoy that in restlessness, so in being restless, in kind of, as I say, crisscrossing the globe and travelling everywhere, and in that anonymity of travelling, that this is her destiny. She believes this is how to live, this is her destiny in travelling. We've got some interesting things going on here as well in terms of the structure, because we've got this word tannoy. And again, it's not even quite an I rhyme, but you look at them and you think that there should be some similarity. And she breaks the word here. The word is anonymity, but she breaks the word here to force a visual rhyme, an I rhyme, except even then it's not quite. And also to create this word mitty to rhyme with destiny, or half rhyme with destiny. And of course we've got this forced enjambment here as well. She forces us to go on to the next line. And I think it's what can you say about the use of rhyme and the use of half rhyme and the use of I rhyme and the structure and so on? Well, I would say this is about kind of unpredictability, really, that you've got these things that, this surprises you. How? And then the rhyme with Krakow. So you're expecting it, and what you expect to happen doesn't happen. Or you've got this thing that looks like it should rhyme, and then it doesn't quite. So you've got that sense of uncertainty. And I think that comes across perhaps in the structure here, for example, in the second stanza, where you've got the colon, and then the very short word yes, and then the short sentence, this is how to live. And it's a sense of things being kind of broken up that suggests that scattered kind of lifestyle she lives. But then you've got that followed by the longer sentence with almost the listing on the beaten track, the Sherpa Pass between Krakow and Zagreb, or the Siberian white cells of scattered airports. So the short kind of fragmented structure here, followed by this long structure. So it's unpredictable, and it changes from one thing to another, just like her lifestyle. And I think where you've got that enjambment here, that's very kind of forced, it's this idea of pushing you on, it's moving you on. The enjambment pulls you into this next line, and it gets that sense across, I think, of her moving forwards, moving on, constantly moving on to the next thing, for the sake of it, really. So she moves on to the next part of the poem, which is her saying, okay, when I was young, I thought this was my destiny. I thought travelling was the way to live. This next kind of 2-3 stanzas, she's saying, so what happened? How did I end up where I am now, when I thought actually I was going to have this exciting life of travel? And she gives possible reasons for it, but she seems to be not really quite sure how it happened. So she says it might have been the scare stories about larium. Larium was a drug that people took if they were going to places where there was a danger they might get malaria. But in the mid to late 90s, I think later 90s, there were some scare stories about it in the media, and people had reported that if they'd taken larium, they were suffering from hallucinations, and also that their hair was falling out. So she says, perhaps I got scared off. I didn't want to go to places where I would have to take larium. Perhaps that frightened me with its threat of delirium and baldness. That led me not to a Western Union wiring money with 6 words of Lithuanian, but to this post office with a handful of bills or a gyro. So she's saying here, I'm not doing anything kind of really exciting that I thought I would do when I was travelling. I'm not in a Western Union. Western Union is a company that's used to make international money transfers. And, you know, if you were desperate, you could get money wired to you. And, you know, there's plenty of student stories about students being stuck in the middle of nowhere, having absolutely no money and having to get parents to wire them some money via Western Union. So she's not wiring money in Lithuania with only 6 words and not really able to communicate. But all of this gets this sense of kind of excitement and fun of travel. But actually, the reality is I'm not wiring money. I'm actually in something much more mundane, a post office. I've got a handful of bills. I've got bills to pay, or a gyro. A gyro was the name for the money that you got from a benefits check, basically. So the suggestion is now she's not travelling internationally at all. She's got the responsibility of everyday life, either having to pay bills or cashing in a benefits check. And again, so we've had that contrast between Western Union, international travel, excitement, and a post office. Or in this next one, and why, if I'm stuffing smalls hastily into a holdall, I am less likely to be catching a greyhound from Madison to Milwaukee than to be doing some overdue laundry. So now, when I'm shoving my smalls is just a term for underwear, quickly into a holdall, into a bag, it's unlikely that I'm catching a greyhound. A greyhound is the very famous long-distance buses or coaches that go across America from Madison to Milwaukee. Then actually now the only reason why I'm shoving my underwear into a bag is because I'm doing some laundry. And, you know, the overdue laundry suggests, you know, her life is a bit of a mess. She can't even keep on top of her laundry. So why now, if I'm doing this, it's more likely because I've got laundry, is really beyond me. I don't really understand what went on. I don't understand how I got to this. And of course, notice again, as in the other stanzas we looked at, we've got this use of some full rhyme, some half rhyme. So we've got larium and delirium, union, Lithuanian, bills, smalls, likely, Milwaukee, laundry, beyond me, however, discover. So we've got this sense of, you know, some full rhyme, but more of them kind of half rhymes or echoes. And I think we've got this sense of perhaps the idea that rhyming structure is there, but she's trying to just kind of kick against the rigidity of the rhyme a little bit. You know, there's that traditional structure that you expect, if you like, of a poem, and she's trying to kick against that, but is actually within the constraints, really. The pattern is there, and although she plays around with it, she doesn't actually ditch it completely and write it in completely free verse. It's this sense that, you know, I'm trying to reject the monotony and the traditional expectation of life, but actually I can't, and kind of that's what's happening with the rhyme. So section 2 of the poem said then, so I don't really know how I've ended up here, what happened? And perhaps there's a sense of failure about that, or certainly disappointment. But then in this third section of the poem, she seems to come to perhaps a more mature understanding of life, or say, but actually I have realised. And what she's realised is that kind of travel and constant restlessness and anonymity that she thought life was about at the beginning actually is a little bit empty, and what's more important are people. And this is where she comes onto this more metaphorical idea of journeying and travelling. So we get that change in tone signalled by this word, however. When during routine evictions is interesting. She might be talking about the fact that she moves house frequently, that she's in rented accommodation and frequently kind of gets moved out and has to move on. Or I think, but you know, only my interpretation, I think she's perhaps talking about relationships here, and I think she's talking about moving on from one relationship to another and being kind of evicted, if you like, from a relationship. So I think she's talking about breakups here. When, during routine evictions, I discover alien pants, it just means, pants that she doesn't recognise, and is suggesting of casual relationships that she doesn't really remember. Cinema stubs, the throwaway comment on a post-it, or a tiny stowaway pressed flower amid bottom drawers. I know these are my souvenirs. A souvenir, of course, is something that, a memento, something that you bring back from your holidays to kind of remind you of your trip. And she's saying the souvenirs from my travels are not, some little trinket from Africa. It's actually these little things that might seem really unimportant, but these are the souvenirs of my travels, because my travels and my journeyings have been my relationships with people. So a cinema stub, a throwaway comment, something that didn't really seem important, a tiny stowaway pressed flower, something that she's kept from a special time, hidden among my bottom drawers. These are my souvenirs. And from these crushed valentines, I think that word crushed is interesting. I think it suggests the idea that, she has, that these relationships that she's had are not necessarily all positive, and she's perhaps been hurt and damaged, but actually they are what have made her who she is, and they are what have formed her as a person much more than travelling to Siberia ever did. So the crushed valentines, of course, it's literal as well, so it's literal and metaphorical, because it's about the pressed flower, the crushed flower, the pressed flower kind of hidden as or kept away as a memento, but it's metaphorical in the same way that the sock is, I think, this unravelled sports sock. And again, the idea of unravelled sports sock, one, it's literal, it's a sock that's literally falling apart, that belongs to someone from one of her relationships, but I think it's the idea, the metaphorical idea of unravelling and things have gone wrong in the relationship. But these crushed and unravelled kind of memories that seem negative are actually what's made her who she is. And that the furthest distances I've travelled, so we refer back to the title of the poem, which we thought was about literal travelling, the furthest distances I've travelled have been those between people. And what survives of holidaying briefly in their lives. And we get the positive connotations of briefly holidaying in their lives. That is what is meaningful, not, as I say, the anonymous travel at the beginning of the poem. So notice at the end of the poem, as she comes to some kind of clarity of understanding and perhaps maturity of understanding about her identity and what has made her who she is, we get much more of a sense of a solidness, if that's the right word for it. We get the rhyme here: throwaway, stowaway, drawers, souvenirs. Well, they're a close rhyme. They are a full rhyme. Unravelled, travelled, survives, lives. The last stanza is the only one with the two sets of perfect rhymes. And we get that sense of this is it now, this sense of certainty. So we can see that as positive, that she looks back at her life and thinks, things haven't turned out as I wanted them to, or as I thought they would, but actually I'm happy because I kind of understand things a little bit more now. Or it is possible to interpret it more negatively. We could say that all that kind of excitement and adventure from her youth has gone, and now she has done what everybody else does and become kind of constrained by the pressures of life, and has kind of conformed to this kind of monotony and regularity, which is symbolised or is suggested by the use of the rhyme in the last stanza. And as I said earlier, we get more of a pattern emerging in terms of regular line length as well in the last two stanzas. My personal interpretation is the first one, that this is a positive poem. It's about, this is what I thought. How have I ended up where I am? Actually, I'm happy where I am because that's more meaningful.